He had been buried in Mercia, at least, Osric thought, as they lay on dry ferns on the border of Watling Street. Elfgar, who had so often in that last year been beside her, ready at a call to go off to skirmish. It was dark tonight, she thought, and a black moon was conspicuous by its absence. A good day to protect the villages along it, and southwest of it, as Sisha's was, and Osrith's mind drifted to her second-in-command, with whom she had often wild nights like this, further north, in his beloved home kingdom. Osrith was pleased he would be going back to Aylesbury, and Muriel had said he would see to his burial himself. A great honor for a man who had fought with bravery and skill. We had once been banished for debt to be in Lord Odda's service. And that stung too, Osrith thought. Odda, once her kindly, benevolent lord, had taken his own life rather than undergo a trial, where half of Wessex would find his disobedience to Alfred an insult, and the other a triumph. By raising the Devonshire fid of non-trained men to go to war against the Danes and nose at Beanflout, he had saved his kingdom and committed treachery in the process. Osrith knew which option she would have gone for, and her mind also suspected that the king had not decreed Odda's actions as welcome, or better, as necessary, for a good reason. Edward had to be married to a lady with connections, and Odda's land, forfeited, now fell into the hands of the very lord who had a daughter of marriageable age, Lord Ethelelm owned Devonshire now, and his daughter was Edward's wife. Not his first wife, Osrith knew, and she had been appalled to hear that the girl that Edward had enthused his love for to Osrith had been sent to a nunnery and his twin children taken from her, to be brought up away from Winchester. She drove her mind away from the filthy politics of the south, and counted herself fortunate that she served Mercia and Lord Ethelred. Osrith, with her men, were now his emissary guard in Wessex, but for the fact that Ethelred was not in Winchester currently, Osrith had volunteered her division to work as guards, as they had ever done, alongside Stipa's men. They need to practice, and keep their hand in. Know who their enemy is, Osrith had explained to Elfrith, who had taken Elfgar's place beside her as deputy for her men, and her friend, told her he could not disagree. If you grow fat in Winchester, you will die at the blades of Danes and Norse. Osrith had told them. Ossier, Egelfrith and Elfkin had stared at her wide-eyed as she spoke to them, while her two men of near veteran age folded their arms in mock obsequence as they listened, something which Osrith had taken a while to interpret. It was their way, as if to say, "Come on then, tell us something we don't know," and were always first in the field, full of battle rage, demonstrating not only that they had listened to her but were doing their utmost to carry it out. And worse, West Saxons will kill more bastard Norsemen than us. Do you want that? They hadn't, and bellowed in agreement with Osrith. She had found out later that Falkberg had been a convicted murderer, and this was his chance to redeem himself for Mercia rather than be put to death when his muscle could be put to defending the kingdom. Leofstan was merely a man who had been taken into Lord Sceolf's service at the age of 11 and had not yet succumbed to an enemy's attack. He was skilled and benevolent to the younger warriors, always willing to show them what he knew, and Osrith was grateful for his experience. She had also found out that Leofstan was an enemy of Stipa, for he had courted the woman who was now Stipa's wife whenever he had been in Winchester with the late Lord of Mercia, and the head of Alfred's guard, who matched Leofstan for breadth and height, had never forgotten or forgiven him. An owl hooted, and dragged Osrith's mind from her thoughts as a foot appeared beside her, and her heart sank as Elfkin tried to find a comfortable spot. He was a worry to her, though she made an effort to ensure it didn't show. 13, and he had not yet the muscle mass to be able to wield a sword. Osrith, as a 12-year-old female, had been taller and broader than him, and had been able to thrust fed a sword towards the enemy, to defend the life of Constantine. She made sure the boy had good enough meat and milk, for Stipa had told her once that boys fed this grew strong, but there was no sign of it yet in the lad. Instead, Elfkin, who was indeed as if he were kin to elves, held fast to his seeks, and could use it to good effect, had used it to good effect when he had threatened Heston on her behalf in the kitchens at Beanflout, and helped hack at the ropes which held fast the gates of the fortress when it was aflame, and they had escaped. She had not shared her worries with Elfrith yet, and she wondered if she did worry overmuch, like a mother worrying over a child. But she wanted the best for her men, not just for their own sakes but for herself, as their captain. She wanted no one to give an excuse that she could not be their captain. Osric had no doubt in her mind that her position was secure as far as Mercia went, but, ever since she had been promoted to Mercia by way of a summons to King Alfred, who had, in effect, aired her shortcomings by way of backhanded gratitude for her bravery trying to save the Etheling from drowning, not Edward, but the child in the water had been presumed to be, Osric had a sliver of suspicion about how she was perceived in Wessex. But not by Stieper, who had willingly sent her and her company out night by night with his other divisions. There was always help needed on the borders to prevent skirmishes, hit-and-run thefts of both goods and people, and generally peacekeeping. Her warriors liked it, for the villages and towns were always grateful to them of a morning, and they were well rewarded with food and praise. Further, they were good at it, and the raids were far softer than those further up Whittling Street. Osric remembered one night, when they had been at a village not far from Cester, Ossier suffering from 3 armed Danes, or Norse, running at him, with a blow to the shoulder from an axe which might have killed him if it had landed at a more acute angle. Instead, he had come off with a flesh wound, which had healed well but, like Osric, meant that holding anything tightly with his left hand was difficult. Here, in the south, the more comfortable climate and abundant crops meant the Danes-turned farmers had little need to steal from their neighbors, and raids, though ever a threat, were nowhere near as intense. So they had an advantage, and had never yet failed to drive back skirmishers. A light. The words were whispered to her by Falkberg, who was lying to her left. Osric pushed herself up onto her elbows to look from the ridge that sat above the town of. It was a good position, not far from where they were guarding, but far enough away to prevent detection, and Osric regularly volunteered for it with her men, for the reason that by knowing the place well, its streets and its houses and its industry, where its drains were, where its stream flowed, they were more likely to be able to respond quickly, and effectively. Look! Falkberg nudged Osric again. Ordinarily she would challenge the man over this, but she would have to do it later. The light was indeed disappearing and then reappearing at regular intervals. We wait, Osric commanded in a lowered voice, hissing out her command to her men. They had not seen anything like this before in this town, and Osric wanted to get the measure of it before she moved. It seemed to be being shone from the west, and was moving as if along the main street, a dim, yellow light, which Osric knew would be spooking some, if not all, of her men. They had a very definite view, being mercenaries, of shadow walkers as they called them, a concept it had taken Osric some time to grasp, but in essence, these spirits were something like the Siamedriel, which showed themselves throughout the land. To Osric, though, this land of Mercia and Wessex felt spiritless, so she did not fear such lights. What she did know, for Aelfrith had told her, was that there had once been a marsh not too far west of the town, and Osric knew that marshes sometimes made lights. Marsh lights, made on their own in this time of the summer, or lights made, somehow, by Danes raiding the town of Seaches, which was far from Watling Street, inside Wessex. When I say, we are to surround the town, Osric instructed. Leofstan, take Ossier and Elfkin, head east, don't move yet, she added, as a rustling began of knees shuffling bodies in the dry undergrowth. Falkberg, go with Egelfrith. Go between the Shire Eve's house and the church. That was the centre of the town. Aelfrith and I will go west, and we will meet on the green. Challenge any who get in your way. If they prove to be Danes, kill them. And at that, Osric hurried with Aelfrith down the slope towards Seaches, Bue's hilt in her hand. She could hear her deputy's breath to her right, and knew they were nearing the culvert, which brought drinking water into the town. The land swept further down where the marsh once was, and her boots were indeed soon muddied despite the fact the summer had brought little rain for weeks. There, did you see? Aelfrith huffed, near her shoulder, as he caught his breath. Osric had not, and she pulled up fast not far from the church. Had there been a moon shape at all, she might not have caught the little bursts of light over the dark ground, and felt a little relief ease a tension in her mind. She sensed, too, that Aelfrith was relieved to find the lights were some sort of phenomenon connected with the marsh. He was as much of a Saxon believer in shadow walkers than any of Osric's warriors. So, at least, It was not Danes using candles or lanterns to find their way around. But a clash of metalware brought her attention east, and she and Elfrith ran to the center of the town, where Falkberg was standing, tall and silent, with a dead body at his feet. A Dane, the man told Osrith, but with no light to confirm it, she could not be sure. It could be a Dane, or it could be a very unlucky townsperson who had decided to use the Black Moon for nefarious purposes, cursing Falkberg for his impetuosity. Should prove to be a Dane, she had told them. How much care had her eldest warrior shown before attacking? How much could he have, in the still darkness? It was such misjudgment which had caused him to take the life of a Shorl in his hometown, when he captained warriors there under Aldhelm's father, and had led to his conviction, for he could not afford the word Ild. Yet, Osrith clapped the man on the back. He had done what she had instructed him to do, and he had judged the man to be Dane. When dawn came, they would soon know. We wait, Osrith instructed, and her men sank down onto the dry grass that was, in effect, the village green. After a while staring at the dark shape that was the dead body, Osrith joined them. Be alert, there may be more, she instructed, hoping her words conveyed that she expected the man to be a Dane. After a few moments, she relaxed further. Anyone out at night should expect Wessex warriors to be about. They had been for months. So they took the risk. A flimsy justification, she knew, but justification nonetheless, and Osrith would take that line with steeper, should it come to it, and the Wessex treasury would pay the compensation. If it came to it. Do you have more of that story, Elfrith? Osrith asked, when their sitting in silence was getting to be more than she could bear. About the two Mercen men who were traveling to meet the elves? And she fiddled in the darkness with the pearl clip in her hair that Eric Thurgilson had given to her, adding, who were going to destroy a powerful jewel. The story had got to the part where, hidden in a forest was the hall of an elvish kingdom, and the hero, Freodas, had wondered at its magnificence. And, as dawn replaced night, with a clear, warm promise, Osrith's mind was soothed with the words of her deputy, as he told the story of the evil jewel, and felt the satisfaction of success with her men, that she had proved she could lead them as well as any other captain, Mercen or West Saxon, and her care to find and ingratiate herself with her brother had long since waned. 2. She had occasion to visit Bukka's wife, Thyra, who had welcomed her to their home and spoke to her of her happiness with her husband. Though Osrith had felt the conversation stilted and trying, Thyra knew she was Uhtred's sister, and would gladly share that with him. Osrith felt, and indeed, she felt more pressure adding to this when Bukka had, on her last visit, taken her aside and implored her to give up the army. Which is why border guarding suited Osrith, for she needn't be in Winchester, unless her company were needed by Lord Ethelred, which they hadn't been, up till then, and she could drill her men with the luxury of time, and they gained confidence and prestige in their little wins each time they were lauded by the towns grateful for their presence. The dead man was indeed a Dane, and the Shire Reeve by the name of Osbald came out to Osrith and her men to personally thank them. He, and possibly other Danes, had been stealing farmware and livestock. Osbald suspected that the disappearance of 3 children one night 3 months before had been at his hand. Osrith had examined the Danish man's face, looking to see if she recognized him, but she didn't, and she took Osbald to one side and advised him to burn the body. Burn him? Osbald scoffed, looking to the Dane, and then back to Osrith. We will hack him to pieces and string him up by the roadside. Then, our presence will be known. It will be known that you are garrisoned, it will be seen as a challenge if, as you say, he had accomplices, and may have already carried off children for slaves. Burn him, and his kin will not know what happened to him, and it will make them weaker. But the middle-aged Shire Reeve scratched his chin, and his face closed down. It might be what you do in the north of Mercia, or wherever it is you are from. Speaking like that, Captain, he scorned, but here in decent parts, we want to know our enemy has been defeated. And so, against Osrith's advice, the Shire Reeve went about happily dismembering the body of the Dane as his townsfolk watched on, cheering and yelling in triumph. She could not blame them, really, and Osrith returned with her men to Winchester, as Elfgar continued with his story, which involved a stunted, ferocious race of men who raided borders and attacked good lands, driven on by a sorcerer, who had bred them for that purpose, and how the plucky kingdom, like Mercia, which stood on the border of this terrible place, suffered, and fought and avenged its people. They liked the story, and it sped the miles under their feet, until at last the Ridgeway was in sight, and they were a day from the capital of Wessex. 88,888,888. Steeper was pleased, and announced that they would return to Seaches after harvest was in. They had some rest time with good weather being early August, which pleased the men, and she had Elfrith warn Leofstan that she wanted him alive, and to avoid Steeper as much as he could. And Osrith returned to the place she slept. The room she had, which was stone-built and nearly east of the city of Winchester, belonged to an elderly widow with a good deal of sourness and who required a high price of rental. Silver had been provided, generously, by Ethelred, for her to sleep away from the men, and that was all she did in the room, whose rent she had to supplement with her own, to the widow, who took it meanly from her, as if she were doing Osrith a favour. So she would go there to sleep, rise, cross down through the marketplace and across to the palace each morning, meeting with Elfrith as the men woke, and they ate at the kitchens before training until noon. This had been the arrangement since they had returned to Winchester, and between border guard duty and sword training, where her men fought with the Wessex warriors, and were bringing on the young boys sent to the palace that year, Osrith was at the palace with her men, so she could be seen, and see. And she was pleased Elfrith was with her, pleased to see Steeper, who praised her loudly when next they were on combat practice with the new men for their defence of Seaches, and she was brought forward to drill the boys, just a bit younger than Elfkin, who stood, shivering with a blade in their hands, though it was hot in the summer's morning, and watched her show them how to stand, and how to parry, how to push up with their blades, and swing back, to aim at the underside of arms, and backs of legs, skills which might be what made the difference between death and life. And Alfrith showed them all the two cranes, though they did not need encouragement. Osrith advised Eglfrith to guide his little brother towards milk if they chose to go there, and explained that it would help develop his strength. She was gladdened when the boy stood by the bar and ordered from Elfber milk for both his brother and himself, so Elfkin did not have to drink it alone. And so drinks Togther in the early evening after dinner, but before night guard duty became a habit, and time for singing and sharing stories, not least Elfrith's story of giants who were in pursuit of the travellers in his story and who, on finding elves, became enchanted in their realm and were lulled to sleep. They all laughed when Elfrith brought his hand down hard on the table, when he told of the travellers falling out of the branches of the elven trees and into a river, as Elfkin started so violently that he knocked over his own drink as well as those of Oshir and Leofstan. Life was peaceful. It was good, at Winchester that summer of Osrith's 17th year. Balmy, high summer days were on their way, and all life busied itself working towards harvest as if one person's role intertwined with another unconsciously, symbiotically, as plants growing beside one another depend on one another for light, for soil, for nutrients. People prepared ground, cleared storehouses, sharpened scythes, for many of the people who lived in Winchester would double up to work on the land. If they were not, everyone had much reduced food that winter, and risked starving. It was peaceful without Ethelfled at the palace, had seen nothing of Ethelwold, and Osrith was gladdened that Edward was growing strong with Steeper's training. He stood by Osrith one morning, when she was going through the training routine with the youngsters, and surprised her by meeting her sword blade. But only for a moment. Teaching did not mean Osrith switched off from danger, and she managed to unbalance Edward's sword, before making to throw herself at his legs to bring him down. Even her men, even her older men, turned to watch, and they bore silence for longer than they usually gave her as Edward fell backwards, and Osrith positioned Buay at his heart. She put out a hand for him, and Edward, genial, sunny young man that he was, took it with happy grace and let Osrith help him up, laughing at his fate. "How glad I am to be on the same side as Lackland," he told her, while telling the warriors, smiling at them all and then flashing a smile towards Osrith, "because I have seen her fight the enemy, and she is terrifying." Then, to the astonishment of them all, Edward went to stand with the Mersins, as they stepped forward one at a time as they fought one another. one single file facing another single file, which simulated a small section of shield wall conditions, the new young boys joining them widening their eyes as they discovered she was not a man. But, while life was settled for Osrith in her work and her home, there was one part which concerned her and, a week after returning from Seixas, instead of making for the palace as dawn was breaking one morning, she pulled out a small linen bag containing silver and pushed it inside her jerkin. Osrith had been filling it, a bit at a time, over the course of the week with silver from the stables, which had hardly made a dent in the quantity that she had originally stolen from Utad, and now she took it north, towards Crapelgat to see Alar, the healer Briton, and to buy lily root, to reduce her bleeding. Shadows crept from her as the sun rose, and Osrith looked about the narrow shacks as subtle movements drew her eye. She was being watched by the Britons who lived here. She was foreign to them, even if she did come to trade. Alar was shaking open her door when Osrith trod through the dried dust, which was usually mud, only it had been so warm over the past few weeks. The Briton narrowed her eyes as she pushed open her shack door, made from what looked like beach driftwood from a wrecked ship, yet if it was, they were rather inland for her to have collected it herself. It creaked on iron hinges as the woman leaned on it, and peered at Osrith through dark blue eyes. "Come," she ushered, as if to get Osrith out of the road, and she pressed open the door so that Osrith could stride past her. "I have silver." Osrith began handing over the bag at once to Alar. The woman grasped it with thin fingers, then looked back at her as she thrust it into a pocket hung at her hip and fastened with a cord round hips, which she drew together and covered with an overskirt. "So I see." Beside her, a pot was on the simmer, and the wood looked fresh laid. A back door was being propped open by wedges of wood so that most of the heat could be drawn out. The woman was in a hurry to prepare something, probably she always was, for maybe her supplies came sporadically and demand might be higher at different times of the year. In a summer, Osrith speculated, desperate farmers' wives might seek her out for sunstroke remedies or something for scything accidents. Winters might bring similar women, as mothers, for mustards for children's chests to ward off the cold. The usual, Osrith pressed. "Lily root, Tansy?" Alar looked at her carefully, as a thump from behind her drew Osrith's attention. Ignoring her, Alar turned, and pulled aside a cloth which hung from the main beam of the hovel, separating the main living section from the side, and something which Osrith had not noticed in previous visits. A pair of legs stuck out onto the ground, dirty feet, no shoes. It took some time for the legs to disappear, and though Alar did not strain and grunt, it was clear from the shuffling of her own feet that she was maneuvering a person from the floor. A few minutes later, Osrith saw the top of a grey head as the person it belonged to lay on a low bed. But it was over in a moment, as Alar flung the cloth back behind her. "You may have the lily," Alar conceded, her hand drifting to her hip, where she had stowed the silver Osrith had given to her moments ago. But, she put up her hand. "I will give you coin back, if you prefer." "Tansy," Osrith insisted. But the Briton shook her head. "It can be a danger," she counselled. "Should you imbibe too much? You are not with child, it appears you do not wish to be with child, so you are taking the necessary physical precautions." "Physical precautions? You are saying no, and keeping your legs closed?" Alar shot back. "Some of these treatments draw a fine line between efficacy and toxicity. If you do not need it, I will not sell it." Instead, she drew from a jar some twigs, thin shavings, which she passed to Osrith. "What is this?" "Willow bark. It will keep the pain from you, at your time." Osrith pushed it away, folding her arms. "Keep the silver," Osrith replied, curtly. "I do wish to buy Tansy, and if you will not sell it to me, then please tell me who will." And she saw Alar hesitate. There were no doubt other Britons who would sell Tansy root to Osrith, and it was gratifying to see that the woman did indeed care about what she sold. She had to, Osrith supposed, if she were going to live an unobtrusive life in a poorer part of Winchester. "Return to me, in a fortnight," Alar conceded. "You may have Tansy root." But, she reached for Osrith's arm. "I will supply this to you if you give your word you will only use it in direst need." Osrith felt herself nodding. "For it has many uses, not just that which you intend. It contracts the organ which holds the child in the mother, it speeds up birth. It can be used to great effect. I shall remember that. Come lambing season, Osrith replied, brusquely, but nodded her head. I will use it only in the direst need. And thanked Allah for supplying her with lily root, before striding out into what could be called the main street of the Britons' ghetto, if only because it was marginally wider than the arm's width gaps between all of the other houses. There was a gap between where the houses of the Britons finished and the main inner palisade of the city began. Britons still thriving still after centuries of persecution from Saxon kings lived. She was to pass through was the thoroughfare, guarded, although Osrith avoided any unnecessary discussion about her business by scaling the roof of a storage hut belonging to the Britons and making her way across the inner section, in the opposite direction to where she had been half an hour before, then dropping down into the Crapelgate Road. This time, when Osrith landed, she did not land on dry mud. Instead, it was at the feet of a person who had, moments before, been arguing with the guard about opening the palisade gate. I am a lady. The voice insisted, and added, I have the right to pass here. And we have the right to ask you why. The voice was whiny, and high-pitched, with an air of condescension. Aldred, one of Steeper's younger guards, who thought his abilities matched his high opinion of his own skill. Osrith turned to see who she had nearly jumped on. My lady. Osrith stepped back, and bowed a little to Gisela. Her round stomach, heavy with child now, took a second or two longer to follow her, as she drew her haughty expression round to Osrith, who had withdrawn Buie. She swung her sword towards Aldred, who recognized Osrith at once. His expression became fixed and his eyes protruded a little. Captain. The Lady Gisela has told you that she has business beyond this gate. Osrith snarled the words. But Aldred was too stupid not to keep his mouth closed, and he looked back to Gisela. But, why? Osrith stamped over to him, and let the sword blade touch the skin of his neck. That is her business. As you can see, the lady is great with child. Now, Osrith rounded on the young man, whose comrade had taken a step back, and was staring at the hapless guard. I do not suppose you wish me to take you to the Lord Tutor to explain why it is his wife cannot pass to gain, clearly, comfort in her condition? The man shook his head. Osrith edged Aldred back with the flat of her blade, and nodded towards the other guard, to unlatch the gate. She noticed that Gisela's stern expression had a glimmer of humor in it, and she upturned the corners of her lips slightly as Osrith held the gate open for her. My thanks, Captain, Gisela nodded, holding up her skirts as she trod the mud dust, as Osrith had done half an hour before. Now, Osrith said, resheathing Buie. You will let the lady pass back into the town when she's ready. But Aldred's face turned to one of indignation, and he bore down on Osrith. Who do you think you are, whelp? He demanded, raising an arm. Beside him, the other man breathed heavily. It was clear he knew who Osrith was, and knew that there was about to be trouble if Aldred did not close his mouth. He swung, but Osrith ducked low, then jumped to his middle, dashing him into the dirt. 1 foot, firmly on his chest, and with the persuasion of Bue's point at his throat again, Aldred got the message. Who I think I am is the household emissary guard for Lord Ethliard of Mercia. I answer to Steeper. You know who that is, I take it? On the floor, the man shook his dusty head up and down. Osrith turned her eyes to the other man. And I not know your name? Eckard, Captain, the man said, desperation darting in his eyes. Please, let it be known to Steeper and to the Lord Tutor that I tried to stop him. Stop the lady. Osrith has seen no evidence of this when she had dropped beside them, but she decided to be compassionate. I believe you, Eckard. Osrith nodded, and removed her foot from Aldred's chest, and looked down at him. And, I believe in second chances. You were right to challenge people, she added, as Aldred scrambled to his feet. But, as I am not known to you, you clearly are new to your position. But, Aldred was about to protest, but Osrith held a hand, palm out towards him, and he broke off. And you never challenged the Lady Gisela, she finished, as if she were back teaching in the monastery at Doia to the Uineel children, going through a Bible lesson. She took a step back, and Aldred returned to his position on one side of the gate, Eckard, the other side, giving nervous glances over to Osrith every so often. "You are still here," Aldred observed, when Osrith hadn't left. Instead, she had leaned against the palisade, with her arms folded, and turned her head, nonchalantly, when he spoke. "Yes? Oh, yes," she agreed. When he continued to stare at her, Osrith leaned up from the defensive structure and trod casually towards him. "As opposed to leaving, you mean?" The man stared back at her, as she stood in front of him. "Well, you see, I take it you are a keen young fellow, keen to follow the instructions that Steeper gave you, yes?" Osrith did not wait for Aldred to respond. "And, so, I am assuming that, when the Lady Gisela returns to this gate, your instinct will be to challenge her again. And yet, I know, that if you were to give her grief, that the lady will return to her husband, the Lord Utard, and tell him, and he will come looking for you. The Lord Utard will." Osrith looked over towards Eckard again. "Have you heard of the Lord Utard, Eckard?" The man said nothing, but nodded his head, slowly. "The last time someone upset his wife, Aldred, the man was spitting his teeth out all over the road. And that was for not saying, 'Good morning,' to the Lady Gisela. Now," she continued, noticing the young man had grown pale. "Just imagine what he will do if he finds out you impeded her progress in her legitimate business, Eckard." The man just nodded again, and had grown as pale as Aldred, and it was all Osrith could do to stop herself from exploding into laughter. "So, as I know Steeper needs every single one of youse to guard the city, I'm just going to wait here, and see that the Lady Gisela comes back again, and see that she is not impeded." It was worth it to watch the two young guards sweat it out. It was a matter of moments when a knock came at the gate, but to them, it must have felt like hours. Before the woman had finished banging, the latch was being drawn. Aldred bowed low as she passed. Eckard was looking at his feet. "My lady," Osrith nodded, as she saw the amused look on Gisela's face. "May I escort you back to the palace?" "I am going back to my home," Gisela said, nodding in the direction of the west gate. "You may escort me to the marketplace." So Osrith walked with her sister-in-law the few minutes to the square where stalls were already being set up, and she asked after Gisela's health and the health of her daughter and son. "We are all quite well," Gisela agreed, gripping a wrap of cloth in her hand. Osrith noticed. "I will report them to Steeper," Osrith said, but this drew Gisela to a halt and she looked at Osrith intently. "I needed to visit the Britons for my own needs," she said, her voice low. "Though my husband accepts I need help beyond Christian medicine," she added, "if he believes I have gone for myself, he may worry unnecessarily." The look on her face, brow wrinkled and creasing at her eyes, matched her worried tone, and Osrith laid a hand on her forearm. "I will say nothing," Osrith said, then saw a look of realization pass behind Gisela's eyes. "I went there for similar reasons. But, it wasn't that which Gisela meant," and she bent her head towards Osrith. "I know you ... I think? Yes ... I think I do." "And are you, Lady Gisela, sister of King Guthard, wife of Lord Utard?" Osrith replied, silently, in her own head. "I am sister-in-law to you twice over." "At the palace, my lady, I am a guard, a warrior." "A woman warrior," Gisela mused, her voice louder as the conversation became much more legitimate again. "We have had many in my own country. Few here, in the Saxon lands." "Many in Irion," Osrith noted. "And this is whence you come?" Gisela asked. "Irion?" "Amongst other places," she replied, opaquely. "I am Lackland, I earn my living by my sword. But yes, women warriors are more common in Irion and Alba." "And you like to fight?" Gisela asked, as they began walking again. The market was just in view, and already traders were getting their boards raised up and flat, ready to fill with goods, food, meat, ironware, everything needed to run a city. "I grew to it," Osrith replied, truthfully. "I became good at it. I would not make a good wife nor a good mother." She looked at Gisela's stomach. "Does your baby come soon?" she added, glad to be able to change the subject. Within the next month, probably within the next 2 weeks. He wriggles so, she added, laughing lightly. My thanks, Captain Osrith. Osrith replied, then nodded to the lady, before striding off briskly towards the palace. Enough time to get some food into her, while talking with Elfrith before the day's training. 88,888,888. And it had been a tough training that day. Osrith had taken herself away for half an hour before supper to imbibe the lily root she had bought, wondering if she should have taken the willow bark as well. Not that she needed the tansy, she had no intention of being with a man. Her work as a captain was going well, and Osrith felt that if she never saw a man again like that it would suit her well. As she sipped the broth, she overheard Steeper speaking to Elfrith, and made herself known in the armory. We are to march north, to challenge the Danes, Steeper told her. They have attacked Alton, north of here. We move tomorrow, so you should make ready. And from him, Osrith learned that Heston was leading men, once commanded by Eric and Siegfried, and another Dane. There was always another Dane, by the name of Sigurd Bloodare, was impinging into East Anglia. Does the Lord Ethlied come, then? Osrith clarified. For they were, technically, his guard, not Steeper's to command, directly. The big man inclined his head towards her, and nodded. Osrith's heart glowed as she heard that, another opportunity to lead her men in victory, to have them fight for their beloved Mercia, and she put her hand to the Thor's hammer at her neck, one she had used to perfect her disguise when going about her subterfuge at Beamflout, though she wore no cross, wondering again why it was she kept it. Taking it off had felt like a loss, and it was a constant reminder, when she was called out as a woman by the West Saxon men as part of the practicing the battle drills, that she had achieved something. Her men around her reminded Osrith of that, too, and thought at how quickly the Thurgilsons had been replaced, like water from a hole in the sand on a beach. Remove what is there and more comes flooding in to replace it. She caught up with Elfrith, and told him she needed the men in the training ground that night, and spoke to them, briefly, that they would be fighting in Wessex and to be prepared for they would be likely marching at dawn, and Osrith was gratified to see that not one of them, not even Elfkin, shrunk from her words. Indeed, after she had announced that the alehouse was where they would repair, while waiting for further instructions, and the men were positively exuberant at marching out. Osrith stood them drinks, 3 milks and 3 ales, and they found seats near the door, entertaining themselves with their usual, guess the next man in game, which was very silly, and involved in trying to guess whether the man would be fair or dark-haired, tall or short, stocky, or thin, and so on, and resulted in laughter as they argued their point. It was innocuous. Until Steeper came in. The head of Alfred's guard had his attention drawn to Osrith and her men when raucous laughter came from their table. Leofstan, who was already laughing about a comment Falkberg had said 3 people ago, laughed again when Ossier added, very tall, and Egelfrith continued with, Cloud Bruiser, both of the younger men grasping control of themselves as Steeper strode over to them. Captain Osrith, you are to report to the king, he told her, eyeing the Mercian warriors again. Immediately, Osrith made to get up, but he stayed his hand. Finish your drink, with your ... men. His eye caught Leofstan's for a brief moment. The king is at prayer, come after the prayer bell has rung. Understood, Osrith replied, as her heart soared with the anticipated instructions, and she waited for Steeper to turn, which he did so, before turning back to them, as a poorly disguised titter drew his attention. Good evening, he added, when he couldn't work out what the joke was, or even, who to challenge over it. The door pushed open and more men came in, Uhtred, with his warriors, and 1 or 2 more of the Wessex guards, Aldred and Eckard with them. Cloud Bruiser, Ossier repeated the comment, beginning to laugh again, but Egelfrith nudged him, as Uhtred surveyed the pub, and noted them. Not him, Egelfrith corrected his friend, not tall. Thor lover? Osrith gripped his shoulder, forcefully. Duindubule, idiot. She shouted, pushing him back, and growling by his ear, hissed, we all need you tomorrow, understand? I do not want him to give you back to me in pieces. Understand? Egelfrith nodded, and Osrith let him go. Elfrith picked up her milk pot and sniffed it. No, just goat's milk, he said, grinning, and Osrith relaxed, and smiled, giving them all permission to laugh as her deputy broke the tension. Then, he pointed over to the door, which was propped open now by two more West Saxons, as two maids from the palace walked by. And, if they came in, Ossier, what would you say then? This made the young man blush, and he took up his ale, and they laughed again. And they talked about the women in the palace, as the older men teased the younger men. Elfrith held up his hands, defensively, whenever the subject of boasting about women came up, protesting that Ethel, his wife, would find out. But, no harm in looking, he commented, and Osrith realized that she had been glancing over to Uhted's table. Finan caught her eye, and she looked over to Falkbald, who was chatting quietly to Leofstan. No harm, Leofstan agreed, his own eye on Steeper, who had gone to join Uhtred, sitting with his ale pot next to Sihtric, but not for you, Captain. Falkberg nodded towards the two women, who were standing on a balcony, paws showing themselves to begin their night's work. Not at all, Osrith said, firmly. You do keep looking at the table over there, where Lord Uhtred is sitting, Elfrith teased. You realize he is married? Yes. He was married before, was he not, Elfrith, when we had to guard the woman he threw over? Her deputy fell silent. She hadn't meant to be sharp, but she felt a hot guilt on her face. She had been looking at Finan, and she wished now that she had managed to keep her feelings to herself. And I met his wife this morning, as those two, she pointed out Aldred and Eckard, were making life difficult for her. She picked up her milk, and shrugged. If I married I could not fight. Life does not allow for that, not here, anyway. Women fight where you're from? Falkberg asked, putting down his ale pot hoping that she would stand another round. Osrith nodded to Leofstan, and handed him a silver coin, feeling generous. Go and get them, she said, and stood aside so the younger men could approach the bar. Women can die by a sword, so she learns to defend herself, she said, quietly to Elfrith. Many women, ferocious Aryan women, fought north there, and were successful. Better to fight than to be raped and die. Better to fight than to die in childbirth. Believe me, I would make a poor wife and mother. I make a better warrior. And, she sipped her milk again, as Ossier approached the table and took up her pot. I've got to report to the king tonight, for orders. I can fight, at least. You can, Elfrith agreed. We all saw you. You are as good as any man I have known. Better than many, I think. But, whatever Elfrith thought, Osrith never found out, as a shout went up to the bar. Steeper was leaning over Falkberg, trying to get at Leofstan, spilling their drinks onto the earth and straw as he tried. He has done nothing, Steeper. Osrith exclaimed, hurrying over. The head of Alfred's guard looked to her, and loosed Leofstan's jerkin. He nodded, once, and stood back, and 5 fixed-faced men went with her back to the table, Elfrith staring at them. Did you say anything? Osrith asked, warningly. Leofstan shook his head. No, Captain, he did not, Falkberg replied. And then Elfkin spoke. It was me. I repeated the joke. The joke? Osrith asked, and Elfkin's face fell. What Ecglfrith said, he replied, and Osrith sighed inwardly. Cloud Bruiser. It was funny, for about 2 seconds. After that, it was tiresome. But, Elfkin was only a young boy and that was the funniest it got for someone who was 12. And he found it funny, did he? Steeper. Elfkin shook his head. Drink your milk, then, she urged, and they talked quietly amongst themselves, about battle and the northern part of Wessex, and the two women, who were now hanging over the balcony, trying to get the attention of the men. Ossier grinned at one of them, and Ecglfrith laughed, before saying one name to him, Eckberg. Then, as Osrith stood yet another round, which Elfrith and Falkberg went to collect, she noticed a man leaning down towards Aldred, looking at Osrith, then grinned. They were not discreet about it, and hadn't meant to be. It was an insult to her, directly. Worse, however, Leofstan saw it, and got to his feet immediately. No. Osrith urged, but Leofstan pulled from her hand, his chair falling over behind him. That man was insulting you, Leofstan complained. And Osrith knew that was not tolerated. Captains stood by you. You stood by captains. He was not. Osrith insisted, for Stipa had instinctively stood beside his warriors, glancing down to Aldred, who was still grinning a little at the corners of his mouth. He was, said a voice beside Stipa, a sing-song voice belonging to the man who had just bent over to Aldred and whispered to him, Ethelwold. Osrith's heart sank. He said that while you may be able to tell him what to do in a morning, if it were night, it would be him doing the telling. Silence exploded for a moment, then Finan put his arm on his friend's arm, but Utad pulled away as Osrith said to Elfrith, the Lady Gisela. The Lady Gisela what? Utad demanded, but Osrith did not reply. Instead she pulled Leofstan back as Aldred pushed back his own chair and got up, standing beside Stipa. Osrith's heart fell as Stipa trod towards Leofstan, standing with his arms folded beside him. This man insulted her. Osrith snapped the qualifying information to her brother as Shay urged Falkberg to his feet. Leofstan! She yelled, as her oldest warrior barreled across the pub's floor, striking Aldred in the face as he launched himself at Stipa. Behind him, Utad glanced at Osrith, before stepping past the two fighting men, to haul Aldred to his feet. Can you help? Osrith screamed at Utad's men, as Falkberg pulled back Leofstan's fist, only for it to swing into his own face. Stipa was, to be fair, not on the offensive, and where he was fighting he was defending himself. Stipa. Big man. Finan shouted, as he and Falkberg took an arm each of Leofstan, and pulled him back, dodging as he nearly got a punch to his temple. Elfrith dragged Leofstan off him, and pushed him in the direction of Osrith's company, and her heart sank as she saw Ethelwold, back to the wall of the pub and leaning nonchalantly on it, arms folded. This ends. Osrith declared, standing between Leofstan and Stipa again, holding a hand, palm towards each man. Are we not going to fight the bastard Danes tomorrow? Don't let them win by killing one another tonight. Then, she turned to her men. Come on. She urged, as Oshir took some more sips of his milk, some of it spilling as Egelfrith pulled at his friend's arm. Come on. Osrith urged, as the evening bell signaling prayer's end filled the air around the chapel. Leofstan. What did I tell you? None of her men answered her, and Osrith leaned over to Elfrith. I have to go to the king's meeting now, get him back. She looked at the intoxicated Leofstan, get them all back Elfrith, and I will talk to him in the morning. And watched her warriors walk, stagger, lope, towards the guardroom, and sighed. She hoped the king would not take too long, and touched her cheek, which had been bruised when she had intervened between Leofstan and Stipa.